The note that ended my life was written on hotel stationery. 5-star cream-colored heavyweight paper. The kind of paper that feels important in your hands. The kind you use to sign deals or write wills. He used it to write my obituary. It wasn't signed. A final, perfect act of cowardice. He couldn't even put his name on the murder weapon. Before that note, my world was a symphony of controlled perfection. My name is Jessica Hayes. Or it was. Now it's Sterling. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You have to understand who I was to understand who I've become. I wasn't a girl who dreamed of weddings. I was a girl who built them. I was an event planner. No, that's not right. I was more than that. I was an architect of moments. I took the chaotic, formless desires of the wealthy and turned them into breathtaking, unforgettable experiences. My life was a fortress of logistics, a curated gallery of aesthetics. It was a relentless forward march of ambition. I wasn't born into their world. I didn't have a trust fund to cushion my falls or a family name to open doors. I clawed my way into every room I ever entered. My parents were good people, middle-class people, who taught me the value of $1 and the ache of an honest day's work. They couldn't give me connections, but they gave me a spine of steel. While the girls I would later serve were debating which Ivy League to attend, I was working 2 jobs and sketching lighting plots on napkins during my lunch break. My dreams weren't about finding a prince. They were about building an empire. I wanted my name, Hayes Events, to be the one whispered in every boardroom, the one printed on the invitations for every important charity function in Manhattan. I was precise. I was meticulous. I left nothing to chance. My apartment was minimalist gray and white. My schedule was color-coded down to the minute. My emotions were a resource to be managed, not indulged. I was a machine of my own making, and I was proud of it. Then I met Michael Sterling. He wasn't part of the plan. He was a beautiful, unexpected deviation, the heir to the Sterling fortune. His father, Richard Sterling, was a legend, a titan of industry who had built a global empire from the dirt up. Michael was his polished, disappointing son. I didn't see it then, of course. I saw the charm. The easy smile, the way he looked at me, not like a project manager, but like a woman. He seemed to see past the armor, past the ambition. He saw me, or so I let myself believe. He was the one world I was trying to conquer, and for the first time, I thought maybe I didn't have to conquer it. Maybe I could just be invited in. I remember one night, we were at some dreadful gallery opening. All glass and pretense. I was pointing out the flaws in the event execution. The bar was poorly placed, creating a bottleneck. The acoustics were terrible. The canapes were uninspired. I was just thinking aloud, my professional brain whirring away. He stopped me, took my hand and said, "You see the world differently, don't you? You see the matrix behind everything." He smiled. "It's brilliant." In that moment, I felt seen, understood. He didn't just see the warm, engaging hostess I presented to clients. He saw the quietly observant strategist underneath. It felt like love. Now I realize it was just reconnaissance. He was studying the enemy. He pursued me relentlessly. He sent orchids to my office, not roses. He remembered I found them cliché. He made reservations at restaurants that took months to get into. He integrated himself into my life with the same seamless efficiency I used to plan my events. And slowly, carefully, I let the walls of my fortress come down, brick by brick. I allowed myself to believe in the fairy tale. The workaholic who finds love. The girl from the outside who wins the prince. It was a story I would have pitched to a client, a perfect narrative. I loved him. God, that's the part that's so hard to admit now. It wasn't an act. It wasn't a strategic merger. I genuinely stupidly loved him. I loved the way he'd pull me away from my laptop at 2 a.m. and make me dance. I loved the quiet weekends we'd spend at the family vineyard, away from the city. I thought we were building a future. He was just building a trap. The wedding was going to be my masterpiece. My magnum opus, not just as a bride, but as a planner. It was the ultimate demonstration of my craft. The Sterling Vineyard estate in late autumn. 300 of the most powerful, most influential people in the world. The ceremony was set by the lake, under a canopy of ancient oaks. I'd designed an aisle of white rose petals that would seem to float on the water. The reception was in a custom-built glass pavilion, so the guests could dine under the stars. Every detail, from the thread count of the napkins to the specific vintage of sterling wine being served, had been personally curated by me. It was more than a wedding. It was my coronation. The moment the girl who fought her way in became the queen. It was a monument to our love, yes, but it was also the pinnacle of my career, the ultimate Hayes event. And then, it was all over, the morning of. My suite was a hive of calm activity. Hair, makeup, my mother weeping softly in the corner, my dress, a miracle of silk and lace, hung on the door like a promise. I felt a strange sense of peace. All the planning, all the work was done. All that was left was to walk down the aisle and start my life. That's when the knock came. A bellboy looking nervous, holding a single envelope on a silver tray. It was addressed to me, in Michael's familiar, arrogant handwriting. I thought it was a love letter, a final, romantic gesture before we met at the altar. My maid of honor giggled, "Oh, how sweet." "Read it." I opened it. The paper was thick, expensive. Hotel stationery from the suite he was staying in across the estate. And the words. The words were acid, 4 sentences. That's all it took to detonate my life. There was no signature. He hadn't even afforded me that courtesy. My breath left my body. The room fell silent. I could feel every eye on me. I read it again, and again, trying to make the words rearrange themselves into something else, something that made sense. But they wouldn't. Gold digger. Free ride ends. The accusation was so vile, so perfectly engineered to cause maximum damage. It wasn't just a breakup. It was a character assassination. He was projecting his own greatest fear, that he was nothing without his father's money, onto me. The moments that followed are a blur of exquisite agony. The phone call to my father, the look on my mother's face, the frantic whispers of the staff, the symphony of cancellation. My assistant pale and shaking showing me her phone. It had already started. The news was spreading through the guests like a virus. The wedding is off. She was only after his money. Can you believe the nerve? I was no longer a bride. I was a cautionary tale. A punchline. In the space of an hour, I lost everything. Not just a fiancé. I lost my name. The name I had worked so hard to build. Hayes Events. It was now synonymous with scandal. The next day, the calls started. My 2 biggest clients for the spring season canceled. Their assistants were polite, but the message was clear. My reputation was radioactive. I was a grifter, a cheap social climber who had been caught. The narrative was set, written by the sterling PR machine. Michael was the victim, the virtuous son who had wisely escaped the clutches of a manipulative harpy. And I was the villain. The humiliation was a physical thing. It felt like being flayed alive in the public square. Every column, every blog post, every whispered rumor was another cut. I tried to fight it. I drafted a statement, a denial. But what could I say? I really loved him? I'm not a gold digger. It sounded pathetic even to me. My voice was a whisper against the hurricane of their influence. There is no court for a crime like this. There's no lawsuit you can file for the systemic destruction of your soul. The law doesn't protect you from a whisper campaign orchestrated by the powerful. In fact, the system isn't broken. I realized that with chilling clarity, sitting alone in my apartment surrounded by wedding gifts that now felt like funeral wreaths. The system was working perfectly. It was designed to protect men like Michael, men with money and power and the right last name. It was designed to crush women like me. That realization changed everything. The grief, the shame, the heartbreak. It all began to cool, to harden. It compressed inside my chest from a raging fire into a small, perfect diamond of hate. Cold, clear, and indestructible. I saw my path forward. There was no justice to be had. There was no reputation to salvage. My old life was gone. He had burned it to the ground. But an arsonist always leaves something behind, fuel. He had left me with a new identity, a new label. He had branded me a gold digger, Fine, so be it. If the world was determined to see me as a gold digger, then I would become the greatest one it had ever known. If they wanted a villain, I would give them a monster. Revenge wasn't just an option. It was the only thing I had left. It was the only way to take back the power that had been stolen from me. My ambition, that relentless engine that had driven me my whole life, found a new, singular purpose. It wasn't about building an empire anymore. It was about razing one to the ground. My old life ended with a note. My new one would begin with a proposition. He thought he was closing a chapter, but all he did was give me the title of a new book. The story was no longer a romance. It was going to be a tragedy, and he was going to be the star. He thought a few words on a piece of paper could erase me. Michael Sterling, the man I was supposed to marry, left me at the altar with a note calling me a gold digger. In a single morning, my life's work, my reputation, and my heart were publicly executed. The world he had welcomed me into, the high society of Manhattan, turned on me in an instant, and the career I had built with my own 2 hands crumbled to dust. The system offered no justice. It only protected its own. But in the ashes of that perfect, ruined wedding, I found a new purpose. A chilling clarity. If they were so determined to brand me a gold digger, I would become the greatest the world had ever seen. My fiancé thought he was ending my free ride. He never imagined I'd just upgrade my ticket. He never imagined that while he was hiding, I was walking toward his father. The Sterling Estate Library was a tomb of dark wood and old money. The air smelled of leather, whiskey, and regret. Richard Sterling sat behind a desk the size of a small car, a relic built from the timber of a company he'd destroyed a century ago. The wreckage of the day was outside, the wilting flowers, the fleeing guests, the caterers packing up a feast that would never be eaten. But in here, the silence was absolute. He hadn't summoned me. I had walked in uninvited, my wedding dress trailing behind me like a ghost. He looked up, his eyes the color of a winter sky, cold, clear, and unforgiving. They were the one thing Michael had inherited from him, but on the son they looked petulant. On the father they looked lethal. I didn't cry. I didn't plead. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing the broken little girl his son had created. I had spent the last hour in my suite, not weeping but strategizing. The grief was still there, a block of ice in my chest, but I built my new life around it. I approached his desk as if it were a boardroom table and I was there to close a deal. "Richard?" I said. My voice didn't shake. It was the calm, controlled voice I used with difficult clients. "Your son has created a significant public relations crisis for your family." He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his eyes never leaving my face. He was assessing me, calculating. This was his language. Not emotion, not family, business. "My son," he said, his voice a low gravelly hum, "has proven himself to be a fool." "This is not news to me." "It is now public news," I countered. "He has not only humiliated me, he has made the Sterling name look weak, unstable. He fled his own wedding. He abandoned his partner at the first sign of pressure. Tell me, is that the image you want for the future CEO of your empire? Cowardice?" A muscle twitched in his jaw. I had struck a nerve. The word cowardice was the deadliest insult in his vocabulary. "What is it you want, Jessica?" he asked. "Money. A settlement to disappear quietly? Name your price." I almost laughed. It was so predictable, so simple. That's how Michael would have seen this. A transaction. "I don't want your money," I said, leaning forward slightly, placing my hands on the polished wood of his desk. "I want your name." He raised an eyebrow, the first flicker of genuine surprise I had ever seen on his face. "The wedding is paid for," I continued, my plan spilling out, cold and fully formed. "The guests are still in the state. The scandal is still fresh. In a few hours, the story will be Michael Sterling jilts fiancé. But we can change that. We can make the story, Sterling patriarch steps in, unites family, averts crisis. We can make the story about strength, not weakness." He was silent for a long time, just watching me. He was peeling back the layers, looking for the angle, the con. "You would marry me?" he finally asked, the question hanging in the air, thick with disbelief. "A man 37 years your senior? The father of the man who just destroyed you?" "Michael didn't destroy me," I said, and in that moment I believed it. He revealed me. He showed me that the fairy tale was a lie, and that the only thing that matters in your world is power. Your son has none. You have all of it. This isn't about love or romance, Richard. This is a merger. I will be the perfect wife. I will be a formidable hostess, a loyal partner. I will restore the dignity to your name that your son has tried to throw away. And in return, I get the one thing I need, a seat at the table." "Your table?" He looked at me, and I saw a glimmer of something I recognized because I saw it in myself every day. Respect for a predator. He saw the audacity, the sheer magnificent gall of it. He saw a survivor, a strategist. He saw someone who, when pushed off a cliff, started thinking about how to build wings on the way down. He stood up, walked around the desk, and extended his hand. "Go change out of that dress," he said. "Find something more appropriate for a Mrs. Sterling. We have a wedding to attend." The announcement landed like a bomb. Our marriage was a quiet affair, a civil ceremony that afternoon with a handful of shell-shocked witnesses. The official story, expertly spun by the Sterling PR team, was a masterpiece of corporate fiction. Michael had suffered a crisis of confidence, and in a move of unparalleled familial solidarity, Richard had stepped in to protect me and the family's honor. It was absurd, but in a world built on absurdity, it was accepted. The headlines went from mocking me to being in awe of him. Michael was written out of the narrative, an embarrassing footnote. My new home was the Sterling townhouse in Manhattan, a palace of cold marble and colder silences. I was now the matriarch. Michael, upon his return from wherever he had fled, was apoplectic. I remember the first time he saw me after the wedding. He stormed into the formal dining room where I was reviewing menus with the house staff. He looked disheveled, his arrogance curdled into pure rage. "What have you done?" he spat, his voice trembling. I looked up from my notes, my expression placid. "I believe the correct term is mother," I said calmly. "Though I suppose Jessica will do for now. Please don't interrupt my meeting. We're discussing the seating chart for the annual hospital gala. Your father expects it to be perfect." He stood there sputtering, utterly neutered. In his father's house, he had no power over me. I wasn't his discarded fiancé anymore. I was his father's wife. I held a higher rank. The game had changed, and he hadn't even understood it was being played. That was the beginning. My revenge was not going to be a quick, violent act. It was going to be a death by 1,000 cuts, a slow, meticulous demolition of his life, conducted from the inside, from his own dinner table. I took to my new role with the same obsessive precision I had applied to my old career. I became the indispensable Mrs. Sterling. My parties were legendary. My management of the family's social calendar was flawless. I cultivated the board members and their wives, learning their secrets, their ambitions, their resentments toward Michael. The staff, long treated as invisible furniture by Michael, became my army of loyal eyes and ears. I learned who was having an affair, who had a gambling problem, and most importantly, who despised the heir apparent. The family dinners were my theater. It was there I began the psychological warfare, a campaign so subtle that only Michael knew he was under attack. I knew all his triggers, all his deepest insecurities. He lived in terror of his father's disapproval, of being seen as less than the great Richard Sterling. So I used that. One evening, his younger brother, a quiet academic Michael had always dismissed as irrelevant, had a poem published in a small literary journal. At dinner, I made a grand toast. "To Robert," I announced, raising my glass. "A Sterling who creates something of his own, something of value that can't be bought or sold. Your father and I are so incredibly proud." Richard grunted in approval. I watched Michael's face tighten, the compliment to his brother landing like a punch to his gut. He had just closed a multi-million-dollar real estate deal that week, a fact I knew he was desperate to bring up. I had just rendered it insignificant before he could even speak. Another time at a board meeting I now attended as Richard's wife, Michael was presenting a proposal for a new luxury resort. It was his pet project. I waited until he was finished. "It's a bold vision, Michael," I said, my tone sweet and supportive. Everyone looked at me. It just reminds me so much of the Avalon Group's failed venture in 2018. The market indicators are almost identical. But I'm sure you've stress-tested your projections against that specific scenario, haven't you? I smiled at him. I knew for a fact he hadn't. I had spent the previous week digging into every detail of his proposal, looking for the weaknesses. He paled. The board members started murmuring. His father's eyes narrowed on him. In one seemingly innocent question, I had exposed his lack of preparation and painted him as reckless in front of the only man he cared about. But my first real attempt at sabotage was clumsy. I tried to point out a financial discrepancy in one of his expense reports directly to Richard. I presented it as a concern for the family's finances. Richard looked at the report, then at me, his expression unreadable. "Michael has always been careless with money," he said, dismissing it. "Don't concern yourself with petty accounting, Jessica. It's unbecoming." It was a warning, a subtle check on my power. He had married me for my audacity, but he would not tolerate obvious petty machinations. It was a failure, but a valuable one. I learned my lesson. I couldn't be the accuser. I had to create the circumstances for Michael to hang himself. That's when I pivoted. I started encouraging him, pushing him into the spotlight, but only on stages I had designed to collapse. "Michael, you should really take the lead on the international merger," I'd say at dinner. "Your father has been working so hard. He needs your strength to see it through." I knew the merger was a quagmire of international regulations that he was completely unprepared to handle. I knew he was too arrogant to refuse the perceived challenge. He took the bait, and for the next 3 months, I watched him flail, working day and night, growing more stressed and exhausted, only to fail spectacularly. And I was there to comfort him. "You tried your best, darling," I'd say, patting his arm. The picture of a supportive stepmother, all while his father watched his heir apparent crumble under pressure. The midpoint of my journey, the moment my revenge evolved from a personal vendetta into something far more dangerous, came on a rainy Tuesday night. I was in the library, a place I now considered my headquarters. Richard was in Geneva. I was doing what I had taken to doing whenever he was away, digging. I was going through the financials of Michael's various pet projects, looking for more ammunition, for more examples of his incompetence to subtly bring to Richard's attention. I was focused on a subsidiary, a boutique hotel chain he'd acquired, that was consistently underperforming. On the surface, it was just another bad investment. But something felt off. The numbers were too neat, the losses too consistent. At around 3 a.m., fueled by coffee and a cold, burning sense of purpose, I found it. A series of shell corporations. Payments for consulting services to LLCs based in the Cayman Islands. A complex, carefully constructed web of deceit. It wasn't just incompetence. It wasn't just reckless spending. It was fraud, embezzlement. Michael was systematically bleeding the subsidiary dry, siphoning millions of dollars into offshore accounts. He was building a secret escape fund. He was trying to steal from his own father to finally be free of him. I leaned back in the chair, the printout spread before me. The air in the room felt thin. This changed everything. My plan had been to dismantle his confidence, to ruin his social standing, to make his father see him as a failure. It was a psychological game. This was criminal. This was evidence. This was a gun. A loaded gun placed directly in my hand, and a new, terrifying question emerged. What do I do with it? If I gave this to Richard, Michael would be utterly destroyed. Not just disinherited. He could go to prison. The revenge would be absolute. But the fallout, a scandal of this magnitude would be catastrophic for the sterling name. It would trigger federal investigations, shareholder revolts. It could damage the entire empire. It could damage Richard, my ally, my husband, the man whose name I now bore. For the first time, my goals were in direct conflict with my position. My revenge was tangled up in my own survival. That's when he started to fight back. He wasn't stupid. He was weak and arrogant, but not stupid. He could feel the ground shifting beneath his feet. He could feel his father's favor moving away from him and toward me. He became paranoid, watchful. He started looking into me. His attack came a few weeks later. It was another family dinner. He waited until the dessert course. "Father," he said, his voice slick with false concern, "I'm worried about Jessica." I froze, my spoon halfway to my mouth. "She's been under a great deal of stress," he continued, looking at me with feigned sympathy. "I had a conversation with an old acquaintance of hers, a man she worked with before. He let the word hang in the air. He mentioned a certain event, a charity auction that went disastrously wrong. Apparently, the funds raised never quite made it to the charity. It was all hushed up, of course. Jessica is very good at making things disappear. My blood ran cold. He was talking about the Beaumont auction. It was early in my career. A client's husband, a degenerate gambler, had skimmed money from the proceeds. I had discovered it, and to avoid a scandal that would have ruined me and the charity, I had personally replaced the missing funds from my own savings, quietly forcing the man out. It had nearly bankrupted me. I had saved the event, but on paper, without context, it could be twisted to look like I was the thief. And Michael had found it. He had found my one vulnerable secret. "She has you wrapped around her finger, Father," Michael pressed on, seeing he had landed a blow. "This woman is a professional manipulator. She came into our lives and has systematically tried to turn you against your own son. Look at the facts. How can you trust her?" I looked at Richard. His face was granite, unreadable. For weeks, he had been my partner in this cold war. But Michael was his son, his blood, and I was the outsider, the usurper. In that moment, the entire foundation of my new life felt like it was about to shatter. Richard was silent for what felt like an eternity. He looked from his son's pleading, desperate face to my pale, rigid one. I saw the doubt in his eyes. He was reconsidering, reevaluating his investment. I had flown so high, so fast, and now I saw how far I had to fall. I was alone, exposed under the harsh lights of that opulent dining room, and the monster I had created was staring back at me from across the table. I felt the ice in my chest begin to melt, replaced by the hot, sickening rush of fear. I had gambled everything on the loyalty of a ruthless old man, and I was about to find out if I had lost. He had managed to find the one ghost from my past I had buried. For a single, terrifying moment, I saw my entire plan unraveling, my own destruction imminent. But he made a critical mistake. He thought my past was a weapon he could use against me. He never realized I had already burned it for fuel. Marrying Richard Sterling gave me a crown, a castle, and a target. From my new position as his wife, I began my campaign. Not with a bang, but with 1,000 whispers. At the dinner table, in the boardroom, I used my intimate knowledge of Michael's weaknesses to dismantle him, piece by piece, in front of the one man whose opinion he valued, his father. But just as my plan was working, I discovered something darker. Michael wasn't just incompetent. He was a thief, embezzling millions from the family company. It was the perfect weapon, but one that could destroy the entire kingdom. Before I could decide how to use it, he struck back. He found a skeleton in my closet, a twisted version of my past, and threw it on the dinner table for his father to see. For a moment, I saw everything I had built about to crumble, my whole world hanging on the judgment of one old, ruthless man. The silence in that dining room was a living thing. It was heavy, suffocating. Michael's accusation hung in the air between us, shimmering like poison gas. He was leaning forward, his eyes gleaming with a desperate, triumphant cruelty. He thought he had me. He thought he'd found the kill shot. I could feel Richard's gaze on me, cold and analytical. He was weighing his assets, calculating his risk. Was I a brilliant acquisition, or was I about to become a liability? My heart was a cold, frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. Fear was a luxury I hadn't been able to afford for months, but now it was flooding my system, hot and sharp. This was the moment, the pivot point upon which my entire future rested. I took a delicate sip of water. I placed the crystal glass back on the table, the small sound echoing in the silence. I did not look at Michael. I looked directly at my husband. I let the silence stretch, letting Michael's accusations sour in the air. When I finally spoke, my voice was not the voice of a woman accused. It was the voice of a CEO delivering an unflattering performance review. "He's right," I said calmly. Michael blinked, momentarily thrown. This wasn't the tearful denial he had expected. Richard's expression remained unchanged, but I saw a new flicker of interest in his eyes. "He's right," I repeated, my gaze unwavering from Richard's. "There was an incident years ago. The Beaumont auction. My client, a prominent philanthropist, was raising money for a children's hospital. Her husband, a man with a taste for horses and a weakness for cards, saw the proceeds as his personal slush fund. He skimmed nearly $250,000. I paused, letting the story sink in. I discovered the discrepancy the night before the funds were to be transferred to the hospital. I had two choices. I could expose him, which would have created a massive scandal, destroyed the charity's reputation, and dragged my client, an innocent woman, through the mud. Or I could handle it. I leaned forward slightly. I chose to handle it. I took out a business loan, draining my own accounts for the collateral, and I replaced every single stolen dollar myself. I then presented the husband with the evidence and an ultimatum. He would disappear from his wife's financial life, or I would give the proof of his theft to the district attorney. He chose to disappear. I finally turned my head slowly to look at Michael, my eyes devoid of any emotion. I buried the problem. I protected the family name. I sacrificed my own financial security to ensure that the powerful were shielded from the weakness and greed of a pathetic man. I did my job. I turned back to Richard. So yes, Michael is correct. I am very, very good at making problems disappear. Now you must ask yourself, Richard, which of us at this table is the asset? And which is the problem? The words landed with the force of a judgment. I had taken Michael's accusation, his one and only weapon, and reforged it into a testament to my own loyalty and ruthlessness. I had proven that I didn't just understand his world. I was better at its brutal game than his own son. Michael's face had gone from triumphant to ashen. He started to stammer. "She's twisting it, Father, she's—" "Enough," Richard's voice cut through the air like a blade. It was quiet, but it carried the absolute weight of command. He didn't look at Michael. He was still looking at me, and in his eyes I saw the final decision being made. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was a confirmation, a seal of approval. He had chosen his heir, and it wasn't his son. "Michael," Richard said, his voice flat and devoid of any warmth. "You are excused, and you will not speak of this matter again." That was it. No shouting, no drama, just a quiet, brutal execution. Michael stood there for a moment, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. He looked between us, his face a mask of utter defeat. He had fired his only shot, and it had ricocheted back and taken his own head off. He turned and walked out of the dining room, his shoulders slumped. A king walking away from his own throne. He didn't know it yet, but he had just ceased to exist. With Michael's last desperate play thwarted, my path was clear. The evidence of his embezzlement, sitting in a locked folder in my desk, was no longer just a weapon. It was a verdict waiting to be read. For a week I debated. Should I give it to Richard privately? Let him handle his son in the shadows? No, that wasn't enough. My goal wasn't just to defeat Michael. It was to erase him, to annihilate his very identity as a Sterling, to have it stripped from him in the most public, humiliating way possible, in the very arena he believed was his birthright. The stage was set for the quarterly board meeting. The inner sanctum, a glass-walled room on the top floor of Sterling Tower, overlooking the city like the throne room of a god. Richard sat at the head of the table. I sat at his right hand, not as a wife, but as his most trusted advisor. The other board members, men I had spent months cultivating, were arranged around the polished mahogany. Michael, still officially an executive, sat opposite me, looking sullen and defeated, but unaware of the guillotine hanging over his head. The agenda proceeded as normal. Financial reports, projections, market analysis. Then, Richard cleared his throat. Jessica has the floor. She has concluded a strategic review of some of our underperforming assets. I stood up. I was calm. My voice was even. I felt a strange, detached sense of clarity, like a surgeon before a complex operation. Thank you, Richard. Gentlemen. I began by projecting a series of charts onto the screen. As you know, the Sterling Hotel Group has been a point of concern for the last 2 fiscal years. Specifically, the boutique subsidiary managed by Michael. I saw Michael stiffen. He shot me a venomous look. On the surface, I continued, my voice betraying no emotion, the numbers indicate a series of poor investments and market downturns. A narrative of incompetence, perhaps. But I was troubled by certain inconsistencies, so I dug deeper. Click. The next slide showed a complex web of interconnected LLCs. I found a series of shell corporations, registered offshore, receiving substantial payments for consulting and logistical services. These corporations, upon investigation, have no employees, no offices, and no legitimate business function. Click. The next slide showed copies of bank transfers. Millions of dollars flowing from the hotel subsidiary into these anonymous accounts. These aren't the markers of incompetence, I said, my voice dropping slightly, drawing every eye in the room. They are the markers of a sophisticated and deliberate campaign of fraud, designed to siphon funds from this company. The room was utterly silent. The board members were staring at the screen, their faces a mixture of shock and fury. I didn't look at Michael, but I could feel his panic radiating across the table. Who authorized these payments? One of the older board members demanded, his voice trembling with rage. I finally turned my eyes to Michael. I didn't say his name. I just looked at him. And in that moment, everyone else in the room followed my gaze. He was trapped in the spotlight. He leaped to his feet. This is insane. She's fabricating this. She's been trying to get rid of me from the day she married my father. He yelled, his voice cracking. It's a lie. She's the gold digger. She's trying to frame me to take my inheritance. His hysteria was a stark contrast to my icy calm. The documents are all here, I said softly, gesturing to a thick binder on the table. Every transfer is authenticated. Every shell corporation is traceable back to a single encrypted account. An account that has made only 2 types of expenditures: high-risk stock market gambles and down payments on properties in non-extradition countries. I let that sink in. He wasn't just stealing. He was planning to run. The dam broke. The board erupted in fury. But all the noise faded away as I watched Richard. He hadn't moved. He hadn't spoken. He just stared at his son, his face a mask of profound glacial disappointment. The anger would come later. This was something worse. This was the look of a man staring at a fatally flawed product he had created. He raised a hand. The room fell silent. Michael, he said, his voice quiet but carrying across the room. You will resign from your position on this board and from all executive roles within Sterling Industries, effective immediately. Your security credentials and access will be revoked before you leave this building. He paused. As for your inheritance, it no longer exists. Your trust will be reduced to the legal minimum. Enough to live, not enough to matter. It was a fate worse than prison. It was exile. Not a loud, dramatic banishment, but a quiet, administrative erasure. He was being written out of his own life. Michael just stared at his father, his face crumbling. The arrogance, the rage, it all dissolved, leaving behind the terrified little boy who had lived his whole life in this man's shadow. He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a new kind of hatred. A pure, undiluted hatred for the person who had so completely and utterly outplayed him. He was escorted from the room by security, not saying another word. The door closed behind him and it was over. He was gone. The aftermath was quiet. The scandal was contained with ruthless efficiency. The official story was that Michael had stepped down for personal reasons. A few assets were quietly liquidated, the numbers reconciled. Life went on. Michael disappeared. I heard whispers that he was living in a small apartment downtown, trying and failing to launch some pathetic tech startup. He was a ghost in the city that was once his kingdom. I, on the other hand, had everything. My position was unassailable. I was no longer just Mrs. Sterling. I was a power in my own right. Richard's partner, in business and in life. I managed charities, sat on boards, directed strategy. The name I had lost was returned to me, now heavier, more powerful than I had ever imagined. I had won. The demolition was complete, but victory is a strange, hollow thing. The fire that had fueled me for so long, the cold, diamond-hard hate, was gone, and in its place was silence, an echoing quiet in the halls of my perfect life. The engine of my ambition had been my revenge, and now that the target was obliterated, the engine had stalled. The dinners with Richard were no longer tense negotiations. They were calm, strategic meetings about our shared empire. The warmth I had once pretended to feel for him had settled into a kind of respectful, professional partnership. We were a formidable team, but it wasn't a marriage. It was a merger that had succeeded beyond all expectations. I sometimes look in the mirror now, in my marble bathroom, wearing a necklace that costs more than the house I grew up in. I see the woman staring back, her eyes cool and assessing, her smile a perfectly calibrated instrument. And I wonder where Jessica Hayes went, the girl who loved the smell of lilies and the thrill of a perfectly executed event plan. Did she die on my wedding day? Or did I kill her, slowly, piece by piece with every calculated move I made? Was it worth it? The question hangs in the air of my quiet, perfect life. The wound Michael gave me never truly healed. Revenge didn't stitch it closed. It cauterized it, burned it shut, leaving a hard, ugly scar that I can still feel. It taught me that the opposite of love isn't hate. It's indifference. And I am now indifferent to everything. He took my future, so I took his. An eye for an eye. It sounds so simple, so just. But a soul is a hard thing to factor into an equation. I sit in his father's house, wearing his mother's jewels, bearing his family's name. I won. Every objective measure says that I won. So why does this victory feel so much like a life sentence?